Hi, and welcome back for the third video of this series. Today, I'm going to be talking about slavery and its significant role in American economic history. And I'm also going to be tying it back to the topic of the previous video, which would be settler colonialism. So to start off, I want to mention the readings once again. So there was two suggested readings, before watching this video and kind of the lesson I've prepared. And, I want to give you a choice on which one to watch, but, you would have seen it at the end of my previous video where I mentioned, one is Edward E. Baptist's talk at Google on his book, The Half Has Never Been Told, about, kind of the economic side of slavery and its ties to capitalism. And the other one is Joy DeGroy's talk on post-traumatic slave syndrome, where she talks more about the justifications behind slavery and how we've internalized those. So, I encourage you to go ahead and watch either one of these. The Joy DeGroy video is rather long, and the video from Edward Baptist, his talk itself is, I think, under 30 minutes. So, I think either of these would be helpful, but, I'm going to cover both of them in my talk, but you just won't get, the full extent of, what they talk about and all of the work and scholarship they've done. So I encourage you to go watch either one of those if you're interested, and I'll put the links down below in the description. But otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the lesson. All right, so once again, this would be, the third week of my course, or the second, main topic that we're discussing, the previous video having been on settler colonialism. Let me move my video to make sure you can see me. Okay. So there's this brief introduction, and then, I'm going to do my mini lecture. And then, normally in a classroom environment, I have a discussion prepared, but I'm just going to raise the questions for you to think about. So to begin with, what I would do for my students is I would pose them a few questions to think about while they watch the reading, about how is Edward Baptist describing slavery as an institution and its role in the economy, or, how does his use of stories, he uses actual stories from slaves, how does that shape, what he's saying and the message? But I'm going to go ahead and break down for you kind of what were the main points in his talk to the best that I can. So, one of the main things that Edward Baptist is saying is that, in the same way that in the 20th century, oil was the primary commodity in international markets, cotton was the primary commodity in the 19th century. So as there's this cotton boom, the United States is gaining an increasing share of the global market for cotton. And he says this is only possible through three things. The first is, the acquisition of stolen lands, which we would have talked about last week in the lesson on settler colonialism. The second is on slave imports as a source of free labor. And the third is, what he terms the quota system used for production in slavery. So this quota system he best describes as calibrated pain used to increase productivity and harvest at higher speeds. So I'm going to return back to this topic later, but how it functioned was the plantation owner would set a quota, and the slave would have to reach that quota, and if they did not, they were threatened with violence, or actually, were experienced violence on the plantation so that they were motivated to increase their productivity. And it's through this that Edward Baptist argues that productivity increased 400% in the matter of 60 years, while the price of cotton dropped by 15%. So this boom and America's increasing market share, means they're getting higher revenue from international markets in the export of cotton, And also it opens up a stream of credit from abroad, from outside of the United States, for example, Great Britain. Also, Edward Baptist links slavery to industrialization and the rise of capitalism. In fact, that industrialization would not have been possible without slavery. So this is what I mentioned in the last video when I said, without settler colonialism, you don't get slavery, and without slavery, you don't get the rise of industry. And this is linked to capitalism in many ways, and we'll go into more detail on that later. But, one way is that cheap cotton was vital to textile production in the North, also in Europe. So it's through slavery that they're able to get this advantage because they have, cheap cotton coming in and they're able to industrialize. So they can outcompete global competition and American industry dominates. And then, he argues that slavery has more similarities to modern capitalism than dissimilarities. So, I want to lay the foundation of, this is kind of his main points in his talk, if you didn't get a chance to watch it. But we're going to return back to some of this later on and kind of work it into, the slides that I present moving forward. So as for Joy DeGruy Leary's post-traumatic slave syndrome, I would normally ask my students to think about, how does she describe the founding of slavery, but also the relationship between this institution and the modern day. But let me break down for you, what are the main points she makes. So her scholarship is exploring the institutions and the disciplines that upheld white supremacy as, a method of justifying slavery. So she talks about history, science, politics, religion, medicine, and how all of these, were used to justify slavery and the inferiority of Black Americans. She talks about how, this is continued in the modern day through the biases and stereotypes that continue towards Black Americans, but also the distortion of history to, perpetuate white supremacy or, erase the history of slavery. So she talks in one section about continental maps and how Europe is by definition not a continent, and yet, it's considered one. She talks about the Statue of Liberty and how it's actually to commemorate slavery, but, instead it's come to take on this meaning about immigration, which really covers up the real history of it. And then she talks about, how we think about the founding fathers, but really all kinds of disciplines. And, she makes many different points here. And she connects this to post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is the effect that it has on Black Americans through over 300 years of trauma, from what she calls the African Trail of Tears throughout the African continent as they were taken to the coast to be taken for slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, chattel slavery in the United States, and then moving on, Jim Crow laws, race-based terrorism like the KKK, or police brutality. So all of this together has an effect, and she says that, there hasn't been an opportunity for healing. And, the US acknowledged it in 2009, but it went largely unnoticed and without reparations or any kind of actionable result. But, she also does some great work, obviously talking about the justifications behind slavery. So I'd like to move on to discussing that right now. So what she tells us is that, in a country where the Constitution says all men are created equal, the, founding fathers, the political elite have to, and actually all Americans, have to find a way to resolve the cognitive dissonance that comes from saying this, all people are equal, and at the same time treating some people as property. So, cognitive dissonance, I want to define it for you here, but it's the anxiety that results from simultaneously holding contradictory or otherwise incompatible attitudes or beliefs. And she tells us this is resolved by, justifying behavior and then relabeling people to fit the behavior. So, how slaves were seen as lazy or unfit to take care of themselves, et cetera, et cetera. So initially, slave owners would think that slavery was a necessary evil to build up the economy. But later on, they come to justify it as a positive good, that they're doing something good for Black Americans, that they're doing something good for the slaves. And then in the modern day, we continue to kind of ignore the significant role of slavery or ignore the real issues here by regarding slavery as something that's pre-modern, uncapitalist, unique to the Old South, and ultimately removed by the Civil War. But I think both of our the videos I would assign to my students kind of charge us to question this, and that it's not something unique to the past, and that it's really tied to the entire country, and that actually these modes of thinking live on. And I put this quote here because, it's actually from Joy DeGruy's talk, and it's from W.E.B. Du Bois. And he says, "In the propaganda against the Negro since emancipation in this land, we face one of the most stupendous efforts the world ever saw to discredit human beings, an effort involving universities, science, social life, and religion." So, this is what is required to resolve that cognitive dissonance. And this is really where her scholarship is done. But let's look at some quotes about, what does this rationalization actually look like? So we have one governor in 1829 who says, "Slavery is not a national evil. On the contrary, it is a national benefit. The agricultural wealth of the country is found in those states owning slaves, and a great portion of the revenue of the government is derived from the products of slave labor." So we see them acknowledging this, even if we don't in the modern day. And then you get another quote that says, "Slavery is said to be an evil, but it is no evil. On the contrary, I believe it to be the greatest of all blessings, which a kind of providence has bestowed upon our glorious region. As a class, I say it boldly, there is not a happier, more contented race upon the face of the earth." And this is a quote from a US representative. So we see this thinking that, slaves are well taken care of, or we're doing something good for them. And at the same time, interestingly enough, there's this idea that Christianity somehow condones slavery, and it was something that was just meant to be. All right. And I want to make one more point here, which is in talking about the Civil War. So we have this view in the modern day that, Abraham Lincoln is this great emancipator. The Civil War was this fight against evil, and good triumphed, and that's where our country is now. But we have to remember that much of this thinking, that had come about in order to resolve this cognitive dissonance stays in people's minds, and it doesn't just go away. So I have this quote from Abraham Lincoln where he's talking about what to do about the freed slaves. He says, "My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia, to their own native land, but its sudden execution is possible. What then? Free them all and keep them among us as underlings? What next? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit of this, and if mine would, we well know that those of the great mass of white people will not. We cannot, then, make them equals." So, the point is here, these thoughts don't just go away. And, we're continuing to deal with them to the modern day. The prejudices, the stereotypes, these kind of justifications. All right. So now let's move to talking about the policies. So the founding fathers deliberately excluded any validation of property in man, so slavery, and left it to the states. So the reason behind this is obviously it's at odds with their principles of everyone being equal. But at the same time, at the federal level, they do acknowledge this idea of racial inferiority. We see this in the Three-Fifths Compromise, where slaves are seen as both property and human at the same time. Or in 1857, we get the Dred Scott ruling, which says that Black people are not and were not intended to be seen as citizens. And I have a quote here at the bottom. "They have for more than a century before been regarded as being of an inferior order, and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect." And that's from the Chief Justice. So this is, how policies condone this at the time. And when the federal level does take action against slavery and it prohibits slave imports, it's only once the internal slave trade, so taking young children away from their mothers, the young children of slaves away from their mothers, and then taking them to new plantations, only once that has become a sustainable system and they don't really need the imports anymore. All right. So now I want to talk about the economic side of things. So looking at the economic system of slavery, you have to first acknowledge that slaves were not really seen as laborers per se in the way modern economics thinks about it, but as commodities or property. So slaves could be mortgaged and leveraged, they can be bought and sold, they're considered a source of wealth, and at the time, 20% of the source of wealth in the United States. And at the same time, um, we get again what Edward Baptist was talking about, which is, the use of slaves being reliant on the continuous threat of violence and meticulous record keeping, that quota system we talked about. And it's through this that you get increasing production because slaves are regarded as less than human and they're part of this machinery for production. Also, we have to remember that the economic system of the time was reliant not on the theft of physical labor, so the work they were doing on the plantations, but reproductive labor. So what I just mentioned on the last slide about taking children away from their mothers and moving them to new plantations. And we have sociologists like Matthew Desmond who tell us about the importance of slavery in the American economy. It says, what made the cotton economy boom in the United States was not in all the far-flung parts of the world with climates and soil suitable to the crop, was our nation's unflinching willingness to use violence on non-white people and to exert its will on seemingly endless supplies of land and labor. Given the choice between modernity and barbarism, prosperity and poverty, lawfulness and cruelty, democracy and totalitarianism, America chose all of the above. I don't think I need to add anything here. I think the quote speaks for itself. Okay. And also, this is a very important point here on this slide. That thinking that I mentioned earlier that slavery is unique to the South forgets that the American North was both complicit and reliant on slavery. So they provided the tools and the goods to the South. They exported and processed the goods then produced by slaves through cotton and textiles. And they were the financial power behind the South, and they profited from slavery. So they were the ones who would give loans to the plantation owners. For example, New York invested in plantations, and with that money, then built the Erie Canal and exported cotton through the Erie Canal. So we see this reliance of the North on slavery. And before the Civil War, we get this quote from Edward Baptist where he sums this up perfectly. Americans lived in an economy whose bottom gear was torture. So we see the importance of slavery, of cotton to the industry, right? And that these are linked together. And without slavery, without the theft of land, you do not get the economic boom that you see in the United States and their dominance in the global market. So let's talk about the ties to capitalism. So this is a new thinking that's coming out of scholarship. More and more scholars are coming out and evaluating the links between slavery and modern day capitalism. So, there's many similarities between plantation management and modern business management practices. So depreciation was originally a method of accounting for slaves as they aged. They tracked, recorded, and analyzed, all the inputs of production. And it was basically a data-driven labor management system, which we continue to use today. And then workplace hierarchies that used economies of scale, really are linked back to this time. Additionally, slavery was the first big business in the United States. The value of slaves exceeded that of all the railroads, all the factories. So it was the very first big business. And then, we hear this quote that says, "The culture of acquiring wealth without work, growing at all costs, and abusing the powerless has its roots in the times of slavery." So, if you're interested in this subject, I encourage you to go and read the scholarship on it because I can't cover it all here, and there's obviously much more depth to it. But it's very interesting how these links are rising between slavery and modern day capitalism. And this image on the right, by the way, is a ledger of, slaves and their value over time. All right. So in two more videos away, I'm going to be returning to talk about, what are the economic policies towards Black Americans after the end of slavery. So it's really hard for me to draw the connection directly from slavery to the modern day because there's all these policies in between. So that's what I'm going to talk about 2 videos later. But, I think you can best guess at what those policies look like from this slide. I actually stole from uh, a presentation from Mersa Baradaran. She's the scholar behind the required video for, 2 weeks from now. And, she has a slide where it shows the share of wealth held by Black Americans post-Civil War, and it's 0.5%. And then the share of wealth held by Black Americans today, and it's 1%. So you can just guess at the policies that we're going to be talking about in 2 weeks and what the reality is. So, I'd like to stop there and lead into a discussion on what I just talked about. And I've chosen to center the discussion around, part of the video from Edward Baptist. And here he's talking about, so when he publishes his book, The Economist comes out and writes a review on it. And they get a lot of backlash and they end up taking it down. And Edward Baptist is going to explain for us kind of what happened, what was the context of that. And I think this sets us up to have a really interesting discussion about, what are modern day feelings towards slavery, the emotions around it. So I'm going to go ahead and play a section of that for us to think about.
I'm not so ready to seem to be pretty well anyway.
There we go.
I learned that The Economist would be reviewing my book a couple of weeks ago, and I didn't anticipate that it would be a rave, but I anticipated it would be a kind of a thoughtful engagement that looked at recent scholarship as well as mine, and tried to put my book in the context of that. That's, for instance, what the Wall Street Journal did in a review that came out this weekend. It put my book in the context of other people who are writing about slavery and capitalism, like Walter Johnson here in town at Harvard, who's written a great book essentially on slavery and capitalism, came out last year. That's not what The Economist did. The Economist chose to charge me with writing a history that was advocacy and not objective. We could debate about what objectivity in history is. I'm not sure what they think I'm advocating. But if I'm advocating anything, I think I'm advocating that at the center of any story about slavery should be the sources, and we're lucky in the U.S. that they're pretty voluminous. The sources that are created by the survivors of slavery, that are the testimony of the survivors of slavery. It doesn't mean that's the only source we look at. It's not the only source I looked at. But it's a source that can't be dismissed. And too often in the writing of slavery history has been pushed to the side and made secondary. And this, if I can read The Economist review correctly, seemed to be the thing that enraged the reviewer the most, that I seemed, to their mind, to be privileging those stories, and that because I put African American testimony about slavery at the center of the story, that made it a kind of advocacy. And so I also think that is that's the sort of chain of criticisms that enraged a lot of the respondents to the review, because I got the review on.
Okay, we're going to stop here actually. So, these are the questions that I encourage you to think about. You know, we can't have an open discussion about this, but, it's something to consider maybe to yourself, and feel free to respond in the comment section. But in terms of, I wrote here healing America and healing from this history. I think it's important to consider these questions. So, why would The Economist describe Baptist's book as a work of activism? And then, what are the emotions surrounding slavery for Black and white Americans currently? And then, why are we still struggling to acknowledge the brutality of slavery and its role in our country's rise? And, I think talking about the reaction to Baptist's book sets us up to think about these topics and think about their relevance today. And even actually in Joy DeGroy's talk, at the beginning, she mentions that, for example, you know, the Jewish community has no problem talking about the Holocaust, talking about their history, and like people are ready to acknowledge it, and we acknowledge it widely. And yet, when slavery is brought up, people say, "Well, that's so long ago. Why are we still talking about this?" So I think it goes to show that there's still some emotions lingering about slavery, and we have yet to really acknowledge it. So I encourage you to think about these discussion questions and their relevance for us. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen then. Okay. So let me briefly mention what will be talked about in the next video. It's personally, to me, one of the most interesting topics, maybe the most interesting topic we cover in these videos. So it's going to be about policies towards Native Americans from the reservation system onward. And in terms of what I would assign as the reading or required video, I had quite a challenge finding one source where it talks about these topics, succinctly and clearly, in the way that there's scholarship on slavery. Not to say that it isn't out there, but it was definitely quite a struggle. I found one video, but it focuses more on all the legal cases, and for my students, I didn't want to make them watch such an intense and strenuous video. So instead, I urge you to go watch this documentary, which is about the life of Dennis Banks, called A Good Day to Die. And, at the very least, I think it does a fantastic job of getting us to think about, what was the experience of Native Americans, and then see how the policies actually play out on people's lives, and then how it led to, particularly, the rise of the American Indian movement. And we can talk about, from there, how did things change and how have things not changed. So if you're interested, I encourage you to watch that movie. It's personally one of my favorite documentaries. I thought it was extremely interesting. So yeah, that's about it. You can watch it on Amazon Prime or Canopy, which I think most people have. So yeah, I'd like to stop there, and I hope that this video got you thinking a little bit more about the importance of slavery as a subject, and how socially it's affected us in our thinking, how economically it's affected us, and then like politically how it's been a part of the country's history. So without further ado, I'm going to sign off and end this video. Thank you so much for listening.